When my daughter-in-law gave me an ultimatum, either serve my husband or leave, I packed my suitcase and left silently. A week later, he fired her from the family business, and now she cries for my forgiveness. The old house, a grand structure of brick and timber I had poured my heart and soul into, no longer felt like a home. It was a museum of a life I had once cherished, a cavern of memories that now echoed with the shrill, demanding voices of those who had no respect for its history. The silence, the profound quiet that fell over the rooms late at night, was a mercy, but the noise, the relentless grating noise of my family's ingratitude, was what truly broke me. My name is Arthur, and this house, this thriving company they so eagerly sought to control, was the product of a lifetime of sacrifice. It was built with my own two hands, with every ounce of sweat and sleepless night, while my beloved wife Eleanor handled the accounts and kept the books balanced with a grace and intelligence that surpassed any formal education. We built Anderson & Sons from a pipe dream into a manufacturing powerhouse, a testament to what hard work and a loving partnership could achieve. My son David inherited the company with a silver spoon firmly in his mouth. He had the title of CEO, but not the grit or the wisdom that came with building something from nothing. He had Sarah, his wife, who saw me not as a father-in-law but as an obstacle. Sarah was a whirlwind of designer clothes, expensive tastes, and an insatiable hunger for control. After Eleanor passed, the light went out of my world, and I retreated into the family home, a place brimming with the ghosts of our life together. But to Sarah, it was a free hotel, and I, a free servant. She would bark orders from the top of the grand staircase, expecting me to prepare her meals, clean up after her children, and manage the entire household. I did it, not out of fear, but out of a misguided hope that my quiet service would somehow earn me a place in their cold hearts, that they would see the man who had built their entire world and show a little kindness. I was a fool, a stubborn old man clinging to the notion of family. The breaking point, the final straw that would irrevocably change the course of all our lives, came on a cold Tuesday morning. David was away on one of his frequent business trips, and Sarah, in her boundless arrogance, decided to host an impromptu brunch for her friends, a group of women as vapid and entitled as she was. I was in the kitchen, my hands covered in flour as I meticulously prepared the pastries they had so imperiously demanded. The smell of cinnamon and sugar hung in the air, a scent of comfort that was quickly dispelled by the sharp, jarring rustle of Sarah's designer clothes as she swept into the room. She looked at the kitchen, then at me, as if seeing me for the first time. An old man, a remnant of a life she wished to erase. "Arthur," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "this is not good enough. You're moving too slowly. My friends will be here in an hour." I was tired, my old bones aching from a lifetime of labor, but her words, so casual in their cruelty, were the final nail in the coffin of my patience. She mistook my silence for weakness. She moved closer, leaning in, her voice dropping to a hiss, a venomous whisper meant only for me. "Listen to me," she said, her finger jabbing the air between us. "Your purpose in this house is to serve. To serve my husband, to serve me, to serve our children. You're a reminder of a life we no longer need to live. So here's the deal. Either you serve David and me without complaint or you get out." The years of quiet resentment, the little indignities, the casual cruelties, it all came crashing down in that single moment. I looked at her, at the smirk on her face, at the entitlement radiating from her like a foul odor, and I saw a woman who truly believed she had all the power, but she was wrong. She had mistaken my patience for weakness and my silence for ignorance. A cold, hard resolve solidified in my heart. A plan as sharp as a surgeon's scalpel began to form in my mind. I finished the pastries, my hands steady now, a new purpose guiding their movements. When she left the kitchen, I went to my room, a small, quiet space I had retreated to since Eleanor's death. I opened my closet, pulled out a small, worn leather suitcase, and began to pack, not in a rush, not in a fit of anger, but with a deliberate, calm finality. I packed the essentials, a few changes of clothes, a framed photograph of my wife, and a small, locked box that held the true secret to the company's success, the original patent documents and a trove of other critical business records, and to my own financial independence. I left that afternoon. I didn't announce my departure. I didn't leave a note to explain my reasons. I simply walked out the front door, the same door I had carried David through as a baby, and never looked back. I took a taxi to a small, quiet apartment I had secretly rented years ago, a safe haven I had set up just in case. They were so wrapped in their bubble of self-importance that they were completely oblivious. They would wake up the next morning to an empty kitchen and a silent house. They would assume I had simply given in, perhaps gone for a walk to cool off, but I was gone for good. And the plan, cold, sharp, and meticulously calculated, was already in motion. The first step had been taken. The countdown to their downfall had officially begun. My departure went unnoticed for a full day. In their grand, self-absorbed universe, my presence had been as unremarkable as the furniture. My absence, therefore, was not a loss but a minor inconvenience. The first sign of trouble, as I later pieced together from a stream of increasingly frantic voicemails, was a call from Sarah, her voice a cocktail of annoyance and irritation, demanding to know why there was no breakfast. Her tone was not one of concern, but of an employer frustrated with a tardy servant. I listened to it from the quiet solitude of my new apartment, a small, unassuming space filled with the kind of peace my old house had long forgotten. A smirk played on my lips as I simply deleted the message. The second call a few hours later was tinged with a little more panic. She was out of milk for her children's cereal. A domestic crisis of epic proportions for a woman who had never had to consider the contents of her own refrigerator. Again, I listened to her rambling voicemail, her carefully constructed facade of a perfect life beginning to show its first cracks. My silence, once their greatest tool against me, a measure of my supposed docility, was now their most terrifying weapon. It was the silent, steady ticking of a clock counting down to their inevitable doom, and they were too deafened by their own arrogance to hear it. My first act in my new life of freedom was to visit my lawyer, a man named Henderson who had been a loyal friend and confidant for over 30 years. We sat in his dimly lit office, surrounded by shelves of leather-bound books that held the wisdom of ages. I laid out the entirety of my situation, not with a sense of vengeance, but with the cool, calculated detachment of a chess master. I had been a silent partner in the company, holding a controlling interest in the original patent for our key product and a significant portion of the company's non-voting shares. These shares I had quietly transferred over the years to a trust in my name, a safety net that was now my weapon. Sarah, with her limited understanding of the business, believed she and David were the sole proprietors. She was the head of marketing, a position I had given her out of a sense of family obligation, but she was a figurehead, a woman who spent more time on social media than on strategy. "Henderson," I said, leaning back in my chair, the resolve in my voice as hard as stone, "it's time. I want you to initiate the process. It's all there, in the trust agreement. The clause that allows me to transfer the intellectual property rights and patents to a new holding company, and I want to do it quietly, without any public spectacle. Just a simple legal maneuver." He had been a silent witness to their cruelty for years, and he understood the profound justice of my actions. "Arthur, are you sure about this? It will shake them to their core. They will lose everything. They lost their decency, their gratitude, their respect for me. They chose their path. Now they must walk it. The only thing I am doing is removing the false floor they built their lives on." My little locked box wasn't just a sentimental object. It held the original patent documents, meticulously organized and notarized, along with the names and numbers of every major client and supplier I had worked with over the decades. I began making phone calls, quiet, discreet calls to old friends, former colleagues, and competitors. I didn't reveal my plan. I simply reminded them of my existence, of the old days, of the trust we had built. I was laying the groundwork for my new company, a company that would soon rise from the ashes of the old. I was the silent orchestrator, and every phone call was a new string I was carefully pulling. Meanwhile, back at the house, the cracks were beginning to show, and the once pristine facade of their life was starting to crumble. David returned from his business trip to a home in complete chaos. Sarah, unaccustomed to doing her own cleaning or cooking, was in a frenzy. The house was a mess. The children were unruly, and the carefully curated illusion of their perfect life was shattering. David, too, was showing signs of stress. He found my note on the kitchen counter, a simple, poignant message. "I am gone. I will not be serving you any longer. Do not look for me, your father." It was a message that sent a jolt of fear through him. He saw it not as a declaration of independence, but as a betrayal. He knew deep down that his wife's cruelty had pushed me away, but he was too weak, too much of a coward to stand up to her, to stand up for me. He was a man who had inherited a kingdom and was now watching it slip through his fingers. The phone calls to me started with him, a frantic, begging David pleading with me to come back, to forgive Sarah. He listened to my calm, steady voice, a voice so different from the confident, arrogant tone he used in the boardroom. "David," I said, "your wife gave me an ultimatum. I chose my dignity. You should learn to do the same." I hung up before he could respond. He was a pawn in Sarah's game, a willing victim of her manipulation. The thought of his suffering brought me no joy, only a profound sadness for the son I had lost. But the time for sentiment was over. Justice, cold and swift, was on its way, and I was the one delivering it. They were so close to their own destruction, so blissfully unaware of the storm I was brewing. Sarah, in her boundless arrogance, was already planning her next extravagant party, completely blind to the fact that her credit cards were about to be declined. David, in his cowardly paralysis, was doing nothing to stop the inevitable. He was simply waiting for a miracle, for me to come back and fix everything as I always had. But this time, I was the one who was breaking it, and I was doing it all to save myself. The day of the board meeting was crisp and bright, a beautiful morning that stood in stark contrast to the storm I was about to unleash. My new life had begun with a quiet, confident calm, but the final devastating act of my plan required a stage. And what better stage than the very boardroom where my son, David, and his wife, Sarah, had so arrogantly held court. I sat in a conference room a few floors below the executive suite, a discreet but unmistakable presence. Henderson was with me, a stack of legal documents neatly placed on the polished mahogany table, a testament to the meticulous planning that had gone into this moment. We were waiting for David, who had called the meeting to discuss what he had, with a touch of his characteristic dramatic flair, labeled as an unexpected shift in company morale. He had no idea what was truly about to hit him. He walked in, looking haggard and stressed, his usual sharp suit now looking slightly rumpled. He saw me and his face paled, the color draining from his cheeks as if he had seen a ghost. Sarah was not with him, a detail I found particularly satisfying. Her absence meant she would not be there to whisper her poisonous advice, to prop up his fragile ego. It meant the truth would land on him and on her, with the full, unmitigated force of a hammer. "Father?" he stammered, his eyes darting between me and Henderson. "What are you doing here?" He laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound that was more a gasp than an expression of humor. "This is ridiculous. You're not a part of this company anymore. You left. Henderson, if you would." He explained in no uncertain terms that I had legally transferred the intellectual property rights to a new holding company I controlled. He detailed the clause in the original founding documents, a clause David had likely never even bothered to read, that gave me this power. Henderson explained that without those patents, every product they manufactured was now an infringement. He explained that my new company, Arthur's Innovations, was now the sole beneficiary of all royalties and licensing fees. He ended with a single crushing statement. "The company you run, Mr. Anderson, no longer owns the means of its own existence." The smug confidence, the air of entitled superiority he had worn for so long began to crack and shatter. But the company, it's worthless without the patents," he whispered, the realization finally sinking in. "Precisely," I said, leaning forward. My voice was calm, almost conversational. "You built a beautiful house on a foundation you didn't own, and now I am taking the foundation back." David sat there, a broken man, the weight of a lifetime of entitlement finally crushing him. He had been so sure of his place, so confident in his control, that he had never bothered to look beneath the surface. He had inherited a kingdom, but he had lost the keys. The most delicious part of the irony, the poetic justice, was yet to come. Just as David was about to launch into a desperate tirade, the door burst open. It was Sarah, her face a mask of fury. She had heard rumors, whispers of my presence in the building. She had come to confront me, to put me in my place, to reclaim what she believed was hers. "Arthur, what is the meaning of this? Why are you here? This is our company, our family business," she shrieked, her voice echoing in the silent room. I looked at her, at the woman who had demanded I serve her husband or leave. I looked at the woman who had built her entire identity on the illusion of power and wealth. The irony was so profound it was almost palpable. "Sarah," I said, my voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to her hysterical outburst. "I left and I took everything with me. The company, the patents, the rights to your products, the clients, and all of it. I've already signed a deal with one of our biggest competitors to license my new technology to them, but only if they promise to never work with you again." She looked at David, who was staring blankly at the wall, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. He had been so proud of his title, President of Anderson and Sons. But now, he was nothing more than the CEO of a company that owned nothing. "And as for your job, Sarah," I continued, the final blow landing with quiet, devastating precision. "David, as the remaining president, is legally obligated to manage the dissolution of what's left. It's a company without assets, without a product, and without a future. So for all intents and purposes, he just fired you. He fired you from the family business that no longer exists. A poetic kind of justice, don't you think? She stumbled backward, her face crumpling into a horrified expression of disbelief and then of pure, unadulterated fear. Her high heels clicked on the polished floor as she retreated, her hands coming up to cover her mouth. She looked at me not with anger but with desperation. For the first time, she saw me not as a burden, but as a man who had held her fate in his hands all along. The tears began to flow, a choked, desperate sound that was a world away from her usual imperious tone. "Arthur, please, forgive me," she sobbed, a plea that was far too late. The world she had built on the backs of my hard work and sacrifice had just crumbled to dust. And I, the man she had so casually discarded, was the one holding the broom. The satisfaction was not in their pain, but in the restoration of my own dignity. I had not sought revenge, I had simply sought justice, and in that moment I knew I had finally found it. The silence in the room after Sarah's choked plea was a masterpiece of poetic justice, a stillness that spoke volumes. It was the quiet gasp before the full weight of gravity takes hold, the moment a kingdom falls. Sarah, my once imperious daughter-in-law, was now a huddled mess on the floor, her expensive clothes and designer purse a cruel joke against the backdrop of her new reality. Her cries for forgiveness were not for me, but for the life she had just lost, for the empire she had so carelessly allowed to crumble. I looked at David, my son, and felt a pang of profound sadness. He was a man who had always had a choice. He could have stood up to his wife, could have defended his father, could have chosen dignity over passivity, but he didn't. He chose to hide behind his position and his supposed authority, a position that was now meaningless and an authority that was now gone. He had lost everything, not because of me, but because of his own passivity. He was a man who had owned a company and was now the president of a shell, with a wife who hated him for his weakness, and a father who had delivered the ultimate lesson. He looked at me, a silent plea in his eyes, but the time for sentiment was over. The time for lessons had begun. The news of the Anderson and Sons collapse spread like wildfire. The business community was in shock. The public was intrigued. The story, as it was told, was a dramatic one of a brilliant founder, a visionary who had for a time stepped back only to return with a new, even more groundbreaking venture. I was a man of mystery, an old lion who had reclaimed his territory. The news outlets didn't know the full story, but they knew enough to paint a picture of a man who had pulled off a business coup of epic proportions. It was all a careful, controlled narrative, a public testament to my return, and a quiet dagger plunged into the heart of my son's reputation. My new company, Arthur's Innovations, became an instant success. The clients I had quietly contacted were eager to work with me. They respected my knowledge, my work ethic, and the fact that I was the one who had built this industry from the ground up. The patents I had held so close were now being licensed for a fortune, and the money flowed in, a steady stream of vindication. I was free, financially secure, and surrounded by people who genuinely valued my expertise. I was no longer a servant. I was a creator. And it was in this new life, filled with purpose and respect, that the calls from Sarah and David began. They were no longer demanding or arrogant. They were desperate, pleading, and full of a fake remorse that was more pathetic than convincing. Their once confident voices were now thick with a desperation that was as palpable as it was insincere. "Arthur, please," Sarah sobbed into the phone one afternoon. "We have no money, we have nothing left. The bank is foreclosing on the house. Please, I beg you, sell back the patents. David, he's a mess." The words were a bitter pill for her to swallow, a sentence that was meant to sting. But as you so eloquently put it, you have to serve your husband or leave. I chose to leave. I chose to save myself. You made your bed, now you must lie in it. But I was done serving. My days of being a doormat were over. I was a man who had reclaimed his dignity, and I would not give it up for a moment of her insincere sorrow. I hung up the phone, a finality in the click that felt both painful and liberating. David's calls were even more heartbreaking. He was no longer the arrogant CEO. He was a terrified little boy, lost and alone. "Father, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice thick with tears. "I should have listened. I should have stood up for you. She was wrong. I know she was wrong, please. Can't we fix this? You chose your path. Now I have chosen mine. I will not be your bank, your lawyer, or your protector. You are a grown man. You have to learn to stand on your own 2 feet." He had to learn what it meant to be a man, what it meant to earn your own way, what it meant to have dignity. It was a lesson he should have learned long ago, and one he was now learning the hard way. The months that followed were a testament to the power of dignity and self-respect. With the legal drama behind me, and the dust of Anderson & Sons' demise settling, I moved into a beautiful, sun-drenched apartment overlooking the city. The panoramic windows offered a view of a world that felt new, vibrant, and full of possibility. A stark contrast to the hollow emptiness of the house I had left behind. I was no longer a servant in a house of ungrateful people, but a respected businessman and a man at peace. I spent my days consulting with my new team, developing new ideas for Arthur's innovations, and rediscovering the quiet joys of a life that was truly my own. I reconnected with old friends, traveled to places Eleanor and I had always dreamed of visiting, and, in a tribute to her love of art, even began taking painting lessons. A passion I had suppressed for decades in the relentless pursuit of building an empire. I kept a comfortable distance from the chaos of David and Sarah's lives, a distance that was as emotional as it was physical. I heard through the grapevine that they had lost everything. The grand house, the luxury cars, the extravagant lifestyle they had so desperately clung to. It was all gone. The bank had foreclosed on the house, a final, cold act of consequence. Sarah had, in her boundless self-interest, left David, unable to forgive him for his role in their downfall. She saw him not as a partner in their shared mistake, but as the weak link, the one who had failed to maintain the illusion of their wealth. The woman who had given me an ultimatum had found herself completely alone. Her empire of materialism nothing more than a pile of ashes, her tears of desperation a bitter harvest of her own sowing. My final encounter with Sarah was an accident, a surreal moment in a small coffee shop downtown. I was sitting at a corner table enjoying a latte and reading the newspaper when I saw her walk in. She was a ghost of her former self. Her hair, once meticulously styled, was unkempt. Her clothes, once a testament to her expensive taste, were worn in a size too large. Her eyes, once sharp and demanding, now held a hollow emptiness that spoke of a deep and unyielding despair. She saw me, and her face, for a split second, was a mask of shock and shame. She walked over to my table, her movements slow and hesitant as if approaching a stranger. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. I'm so sorry. I was wrong. I was so wrong." The woman who had once stood over me with such contempt was now pleading, not for money, but for a simple acknowledgement of her humanity. The contrast was a painful lesson in the fleeting nature of arrogance. "Sarah," I said, my voice gentle, "you are an adult. You are a person who made choices. You chose to be selfish, you chose to be cruel, you chose to be ungrateful. And I chose not to be a victim. I chose to live with dignity. This isn't about forgiveness. This is about consequence." She simply nodded, a gesture of defeat and acceptance. She turned and walked out of the coffee shop, a lonely figure disappearing into the crowd. That was the last time I ever saw her. The chapter of my life with Sarah was officially closed. As for David, he eventually found his way. Without his wife's constant demands and without the shadow of the family business, he had to confront who he really was. He took a job as a manager at a small manufacturing company, a job he had to earn with hard work and determination. He started over, slowly, painfully, but with an honesty he had never known. He and I did not reconcile in the way he wanted, with me restoring his fortune. Instead, we found a new relationship, one built on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding. He earned my trust back, one small step at a time, not by asking for forgiveness but by proving he was worthy of it. He had learned his lesson, not through my lecture, but through his own hard-won experience. My life now is filled with purpose and peace. I am not lonely. I have good friends, a thriving business, and the satisfaction of knowing I did the right thing. I look back on the day Sarah gave me that ultimatum, and I see it not as the day I lost my home, but as the day I finally found my freedom. I left with a suitcase, and in my hands I held a dignity that was priceless. And that, I realized, was a fortune no one could ever take from me. The story of Anderson & Sons was over, but the story of Arthur Anderson was just beginning. It was a story of a man who lost his family but found his self-worth, a man who gave up an empire to reclaim his soul,